The locals never gave the mountain a name. It was easier that way. A thing without a name can't call you back. The trees grew too close together there, leaning like old women whispering secrets to each other, their roots tangled around bones that were never supposed to be buried. People said if you listened long enough, you could hear crying from under the soil, not loud, not wailing, just soft, steady sobs that sounded like they'd been happening for years. Most figured it was the wind, but those who'd grown up around here knew better. The wind didn't breathe in rhythm. It didn't call names. No one lived up there anymore, not since the last fire. That was nearly 40 years ago. But sometimes, hunters still swore they saw a figure moving through the mist, tall, wrong, and walking with the slow sway of something that had learned to mimic men but never got the hang of it. The sheriff said it was nonsense. He said the stories about the mountain man were just old Appalachian fear tales. Folks needed monsters to make sense of what the woods could do to a person. But then, every few years, someone went missing near the ridge, and when they were found, if they were found at all, their mouths were always sewn shut with their own hair. And deeper still, beneath a rotting roof and a cross nailed upside down to the doorframe, a single lantern still burned. Its flame had never gone out, because he never stopped tending it. He was still there, the man who kept two sisters pregnant for 20 years, the one they whispered about but never named, the one whose bloodline should have ended but didn't. The trail wasn't on any map. It was thin, almost shy, a narrow scar of dirt half swallowed by ferns and roots that clung to the mountain's ribs. The hikers, 3 of them, city-born and naive enough to think adventure meant getting lost, hadn't meant to find it. They were supposed to be following the old logging road, the one that wound safely back toward their rented cabin by sundown. But the compass needle began to twitch, the GPS lost its signal, and the forest grew thicker until every direction looked the same. Then one of them, a man named Tyler, spotted the trail cutting off into the trees like something waiting to be rediscovered. It was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No birdsong, no cicadas, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. The air smelled old, heavy with moss and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. They hesitated only for a moment before stepping in. The first 100 yards were gentle, just overgrowth and the crunch of forgotten leaves, but the deeper they went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew taller and darker, their trunks gnarled and hollowed, oozing amber sap that glistened like tears. Someone, years ago, had tied little charms to the low branches, bundles of twigs, tufts of fur, teeth strung on twine. No one spoke much after the first mile. Their laughter had drained away, replaced by a strange awareness that they were being watched, not from any one place, but everywhere at once. When they stopped for water, a faint hum came from deeper in the woods, low and almost human, like a lullaby sung through teeth. The trail seemed to curve toward it, each turn drawing them farther from where they thought they'd started. By the time they saw the cabin, dusk had already begun to bleed across the treetops. It stood at the end of a clearing that looked unnaturally empty, as if the forest itself refused to grow too close. The cabin was small, leaning slightly to one side, its boards darkened by rot and smoke. The windows were broken, but a tattered curtain still moved inside, stirred by a draft that shouldn't have existed. Ivy crawled up one wall and across the roof, and a single crow perched on the chimney, watching them without blinking. Tyler said it looked abandoned, but there were footprints in the mud, fresh ones, deep and wide, leading straight to the door. Inside, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for years. Dust floated like ash in the weak light filtering through the holes in the roof, and the floor creaked beneath their weight, each step stirring the smell of mildew, rot, and something sour that clung to the back of the throat. Furniture lay where it had fallen decades ago, chairs split down the middle, a table warped into a bow from the damp, and a child's rocking horse frozen mid-motion beside the fireplace. In one corner, a nest of dead leaves and bones suggested something else had been living there long before they arrived. The silence pressed on them, a silence so deep it seemed to hum, like the pause between breaths. Then, from the far end of the room, came a sound that didn't belong, the faint, crackling whisper of static. It was coming from a small radio sitting on a shelf, half buried under a pile of old magazines and glass jars filled with yellowing liquid. The radio was ancient, a squat box with dials rubbed smooth and a wire antenna twisted like a broken finger. Tyler brushed off the dust and turned the knob, expecting nothing but dead air, yet the static grew louder, shifting from a hollow hiss to a low murmur that almost formed words. For a heartbeat, he thought he caught the faint strains of a hymn, something church-like, but warped, like it was being sung underwater. Then the radio spoke. At first it was gibberish, words tumbling over one another, indistinct and hollow, but then it said something that froze them all where they stood. It repeated a sentence Tyler had just said, his exact words from a few moments earlier, spoken back to him in a voice that was nearly his own, only slower, deeper, soaked in static. The others stared at him, waiting for an explanation, but none came. Another voice followed, this time belonging to Claire, who'd whispered something about wanting to leave. The radio echoed her too, perfectly, even matching her nervous laugh at the end. They turned the knob again, but the voices didn't stop. The more they twisted the dial, the clearer the echoes became. The machine was speaking every word they'd said since entering the cabin, each one returned with a delay of a minute or two, as though the place itself were listening, recording, and choosing when to speak. The realization sank in slowly. The radio wasn't repeating the past, it was waiting for the present to catch up. They would have left after the radio, if not for the sound that came next, a hollow thud beneath their feet, like something shifting under the floorboards. It happened once, then again, slower, heavier, as though a heartbeat were pulsing through the wood. Tyler grabbed the lantern hanging by the fireplace, its glass still streaked with soot, and knelt to look. The boards near the center of the room were different, newer, less warped, nailed down with care that didn't match the rest of the decay. Claire said she smelled earth, faint but unmistakable, the wet, loamy scent of freshly turned soil. They pried up the first board with a rusted poker, and the air that rose from below was colder than the cabin around them. Beneath it lay a square cutout in the dirt, a trapdoor, old iron hinges nearly dissolved by rust, a frayed rope tied through a hole for a handle. No one wanted to open it, not really, but curiosity had a way of dulling caution. Tyler pulled. The hinges screamed, dust rained down from the rafters, and a gap yawned open to reveal a narrow set of steps descending into darkness. The beam of the lantern barely reached the bottom. The air below was thick and wet, carrying a scent that made their stomachs turn, a mix of mold, rot, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. They climbed down slowly, the wooden steps bending and sighing beneath their weight. The cellar walls were made of packed earth, veins of old roots winding through them, and jars lined crude shelves carved directly into the dirt. Dozens of jars, maybe hundreds, each one sealed tight, their contents floating in cloudy liquid that shimmered in the light. At first, they thought the jars held small animals, perhaps specimens or preserved food gone bad. But as they looked closer, the shapes took on forms that didn't fit, tiny faces pressed against glass, twisted limbs, fragile spines curled like question marks. Some were labeled in faded ink, names scrawled with a trembling hand, dates stretching back decades. The oldest label was nearly unreadable, but the word *mother* was still clear. The newest one bore the year 2003. Claire wanted to leave, but something in the corner caught Tyler's attention. A wooden crate, half buried in the dirt, covered by a stained blanket. When he pulled it back, the smell grew unbearable. Inside were smaller jars, each holding something even more delicate, tiny bones arranged neatly, almost lovingly, like someone had been cataloguing generations that should never have existed. The family Bible lay on a warped dresser in the far corner of the cellar, wrapped in a strip of canvas that had once been white but was now the color of old teeth. It looked out of place among the jars and the rot, as if it had been left there on purpose, waiting for someone to find it. The cover was cracked leather, flaking apart at the edges, and the gold lettering had faded into nothing. When Claire lifted it, the spine made a sound like a sigh. Dust rose in a fine grey cloud that hung motionless in the lantern light, and for a moment, it looked almost like smoke rising from a grave. The pages stuck together, damp and swollen from years underground. Tyler pried them apart gently, each one peeling away with a soft tearing noise. The first few were the usual scripture, notes written in the margins in a woman's careful hand, and pressed flowers long since turned to brown stains. But near the middle, the ink changed. The handwriting became rougher, more desperate, and the words were less about God and more about *him*. They spoke of obedience, of purity, of a union blessed to be fruitful beyond measure. There were names written in columns like a family tree, though something about it felt wrong. The same 3 names kept repeating, generation after generation, as if time had circled instead of moved forward. At the top of nearly every page was *Mary Ellen* or *Sarah Jane*, always paired beneath the same man's name, *Isaac Boone*. The pattern never broke. In each entry, one of the sisters was listed as wife, the other as mother, then both again on the next line, over and over. The dates blurred together, spanning nearly a century, and yet the handwriting barely changed, as if written by the same hand. Claire's voice trembled when she read one entry aloud, *, He keeps us as he keeps the seed, for the Lord said to multiply and replenish the earth. We are his chosen, bound by blood. *. The deeper they read, the stranger the entries became. Scripture references twisted into something darker, lines crossed out and replaced with phrases like *, the blood must not thin *, and *, the daughters shall return to the father*. At the very back, someone had drawn a crude map of the mountain, circles marking certain areas, one of them matching the clearing where they now stood. The final page was nearly blank except for one sentence scratched in deep, shaking lines, *, he still walks, and we are never done. *. When they finally clawed their way out of the cellar, the forest had changed. The air outside was colder now, heavy with mist that clung to the skin and carried the sharp scent of iron. It was darker than it should have been, though the sun hadn't fully set. The light seemed to vanish between the trees as if swallowed. They didn't speak at first. None of them wanted to put into words what they'd seen, or what they were beginning to understand. Tyler led the way, the old Bible stuffed into his pack, its weight dragging at his shoulders like a curse. Claire followed close behind, clutching the lantern even though it was barely burning anymore. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, certain she heard footsteps that didn't belong to them. They moved fast until they hit the trail again, but the forest didn't look familiar anymore. The path seemed narrower, twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The trees stood closer, their bark peeling in long, pale strips that looked disturbingly like flesh. Then, from the shadow of a ridge, a voice called out a low, rough shout that made them freeze where they stood. A man stepped from behind a fallen pine, holding a rifle that looked older than he was. His coat was patched with fur, and his eyes carried the hard, sunken look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He asked them what they were doing in that part of the mountain, his tone less curious than accusatory. When they explained about the cabin, the man's expression hardened, and he spat into the dirt. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he said, glancing toward the fog that hung over the clearing. "Ain't a place meant to be found." His voice dropped lower when Claire mentioned the name written in the Bible. He told her to stop saying it. "Not in those woods. Not after dark." The hunter's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the tip flaring orange in the dusk. He told them that every few years someone got bold enough to wander too deep, looking for the old Boone place. Some went missing. The few who made it back never stayed long, they moved away or went mad. "It ain't the dead you gotta fear," he said, staring into the trees. "It's the blood that never learned how to die." He told them to head east, keep walking until they reached the old mining road, and not to look back, no matter what they heard behind them. Then he turned away, muttering something that sounded like a prayer mixed with a warning, and vanished into the fog as quietly as he'd appeared. That night, they made camp beside a dry creek bed miles from the cabin, or at least that's what they hoped. The forest had a way of folding in on itself, making every tree look like the last, every bend feel like a circle. They didn't light a fire, the hunter's warning still clung to their nerves, and even the small glow of a lantern felt too loud in the dark. The air was damp and cold, thick with the smell of pine and decay. Insects didn't sing here. The woods felt hollow, like the world had been drained of sound. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that feels shared by the trees. Tyler kept glancing at his backpack, where the Bible lay wrapped in an old shirt, as if it might start whispering again. Claire sat close to him, arms around her knees, eyes darting into the darkness every few seconds. The only sound was the soft trickle of water somewhere deeper down the creek bed. When the first metallic clink came, it was so faint that they almost didn't notice. It sounded like something dragging over stone. Tyler froze. Another sound followed, a slow, deliberate scrape, like chains being pulled through wet earth. Then came the breathing. Heavy, human, but uneven, as though the lungs pulling it in didn't quite understand how to do it. Claire's hand clamped over her mouth, eyes wide, tears reflecting the weak lantern light. The sound circled them, slow and patient, moving through the trees with impossible grace for something so large. Every now and then it stopped, and they could feel it listening. Tyler killed the light. Darkness swallowed them whole. The breathing grew louder, close enough now that they could hear the wet click of saliva between each exhale. Something brushed against the nylon of the tent, a soft drag, followed by the faint rattle of metal. The air smelled of damp soil and old blood, and with each breath, the scent grew stronger. Claire bit down on a sob, and the thing stopped moving. It stood still, only feet away, its chains shifting with a faint, deliberate rhythm. Then came a whisper, not words exactly, more like the shape of a voice, low and drawn out. It sounded like it was trying to remember how to speak. A cold wind rolled through the trees, and the chains began to move again, dragging away into the woods until the sound faded into the distance. They didn't sleep. They just sat there in the dark, waiting for the breathing to start again. Morning came reluctantly, a pale grey light seeping through the trees like smoke. None of them had really slept, their eyes gritty and red, their nerves stretched thin as wire. The forest felt different now, quieter in a way that didn't mean peace. The air was heavy, and every sound, every snapping twig or flutter of leaves seemed to echo longer than it should. They packed quickly, hands shaking, the smell of damp earth and ash still clinging to their clothes. No one mentioned the chains or the breathing. It was the kind of thing you didn't speak of until you were far from where it happened. But the trail that was supposed to lead them back toward the mining road didn't. It bent away, subtly at first, then more sharply, until they realized they were walking toward the ridge again, toward the cabin they'd sworn to leave behind. It appeared between the trees just as it had before, unchanged, waiting. The fog hung low over the clearing, veiling everything in a dull, colorless haze. This time, though, they noticed something they hadn't before, a slope behind the cabin, a small patch of ground cleared of brush and ringed with stones. Tyler thought it might be an old garden until he saw the crosses. 2 of them, crooked and handmade, hammered into the earth at uneven angles. The wood was grey and splintering, the letters carved into it shallow and clumsy. *M.E. Boone. *S.J. Boone. The sight froze them where they stood. The graves had sunken slightly with time, the soil collapsing inward like something beneath had shifted. Claire stepped closer despite the others' protests, drawn by something she couldn't name. The air around the graves was colder, and a thin mist rose from the ground, coiling around her ankles like breath. Tyler crouched beside her and noticed the disturbed dirt. The edges were soft, recently moved. Someone had been here. Or something. He reached out and pressed his hand against the earth, and it gave under his touch, sinking just enough to reveal the glint of a nail buried in the soil. When he pulled back, the ground trembled faintly, a movement so subtle it might have been imagined. Then came the smell, a sudden waft of rot, sharp and wet, as if the graves themselves had exhaled. Claire stumbled back, her foot catching on a root, and that's when they saw it. One of the graves wasn't sealed. The earth had been pushed upward from below, a jagged split running down the center, and the hollow beneath it was dark enough to swallow the light. They found the cassette in the cabin's front room, half buried beneath a layer of dust and mouse droppings. It was old, the kind that needed a player with thick buttons and a mechanical click when you pressed play. The label had faded to a pale yellow, but someone had written a single word across it in smeared black ink, *sermon. Tyler held it up between 2 fingers, feeling the grime flake away beneath his touch. The others didn't want to stay any longer, not after what they'd seen behind the house, but curiosity had become something heavier than fear. It pulled at them, insistent, like the woods themselves demanded they listen. The tape player sat on the mantel, covered in a blanket of ash and cobwebs. Tyler blew on it, coughing as dust filled the air. When he pressed the button, the machine hesitated, wheels grinding dryly before a burst of static filled the room. Then came a voice, thin, strained, the kind that belonged to a man trying to sound calm while something inside him was breaking. It was the voice of a preacher. Brothers and sisters, the recording began, the words warped and trembling. The Lord forgives all who walk in his image. But how do you know when his image has changed? A pause followed, long enough for them to hear faint sounds in the background, scraping, maybe crying, the muffled shuffle of feet. I have married them, the voice continued. I did what I was asked. The sisters and the man joined as one, as the good book commands. To multiply, to keep the blood strong. That's what he said. That's what he said. The preacher's tone cracked on the last word, slipping from sermon into confession. I tried to leave. I told him it was wrong, that the Lord's work wasn't meant to look like that. But he said the Lord don't speak to me anymore, only to him. Said the mountain listens to him now. Another pause. The sound of breathing filled the space, close to the microphone, ragged and uneven. I can hear them down below. The children. They don't cry like they should. I think his voice cut out suddenly, replaced by the hiss of static. Then, faintly, something else bled through the recording. Not a voice, not exactly, but a low humming sound that rose and fell in rhythm, like someone breathing into the machine from the other side. It wasn't the preacher. It wasn't human. The tape kept playing, even after Tyler pressed stop, the reels still spinning though no one had touched them, the hum growing louder, closer, until it began to sound like words. The silence that followed the recording was thick enough to feel. No one wanted to move, as if any sudden sound might wake something that had been listening all along. The tape player finally wound down with a slow mechanical sigh, but the hum it left behind seemed to linger in the air. Claire's hands were trembling. She didn't realize she'd been pressing the small gold locket around her neck until Tyler pointed it out. She'd worn it since childhood, a keepsake from a grandmother she barely remembered, a woman who'd died before she was old enough to ask about the strange mountain town she came from. When Claire opened the locket, a photograph folded into quarters slipped out. The edges were brittle and yellowed, the image barely holding together, but the faces were clear enough. Two women stood side by side in front of the very same cabin, one smiling shyly, the other expressionless. Behind them was a man tall, heavy-shouldered, his face mostly hidden in shadow, but the outline of his jaw was unmistakable. On the back of the photo, written in the same tight, slanted handwriting from the Bible, were the names, Mary Ellen, Sarah Jane, and Isaac. Claire stared at it for a long time before saying anything. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Boone. She'd changed it after moving north, changed everything about her life and never spoke of where she came from. Claire's mother used to call it superstition, a family story no one was supposed to ask about. But now, the connection was undeniable. The same faces, the same name, the same mountain. The blood that had been written and rewritten through the generations was her own. Tyler tried to reason it out, said maybe it was just a coincidence, a shared name, a trick of resemblance. But Claire shook her head. She said she remembered, faintly, being a child and overhearing her grandmother whisper prayers in her sleep, not to God, but to him. She thought it was nonsense then, words of an old woman slipping away, but hearing the preacher's voice on that tape made her understand that the prayers had been pleas. The forest outside seemed to shift again, a gust of cold air pushing through the cracks in the cabin walls. The lantern flickered, and for an instant, the photograph's glass caught the light, reflecting a shape that didn't belong, something behind them, tall and motionless, watching. Claire's breath hitched as she folded the picture shut, and for the first time since finding the cabin, she whispered that maybe they hadn't stumbled upon it by accident at all. Night fell fast, the kind of darkness that feels like it's sinking rather than spreading. The fog thickened until the trees became silhouettes, their shapes bending and warping as the cold rolled in. The air was wet and heavy, filled with the smell of soil and smoke. They'd decided to leave before first light, but time had begun to lose meaning in those woods, their watches had stopped hours ago. The forest seemed to breathe around them, every gust of wind carrying a whisper that wasn't quite the wind at all. Claire sat apart from the others, staring into the distance where the tree line bled into shadow. She clutched the locket, her thumb rubbing over the photo hidden inside until the paper tore. She could still see the faces in her mind, Mary Ellen, Sarah Jane, Isaac. The resemblance was no longer subtle. The eyes, the mouth, the shape of her face, it was all there, reflected in her own features. The chains came first, faint but deliberate, dragging through the wet leaves somewhere beyond the clearing. Then came the rhythm, one heavy step followed by a slower one, a limp masked by strength. Tyler reached for the lantern, but the light sputtered and died before his fingers touched it. The sound grew closer. Claire whispered that she could smell him iron and rot, the scent of something that had never been clean. The breathing that followed was not entirely human, more like the rasp of lungs that had forgotten how to work. Something moved between the trees, tall enough that its head brushed the low branches. For a moment, it stayed in shadow, and then the fog shifted, revealing the shape that shouldn't have existed. Its skin hung in folds like melted wax, pale and glistening. The face, or what was left of it, was a collage of features, stitched and layered, too many mouths, too few eyes, all arranged in a way that suggested it had tried, over and over, to rebuild itself from its own bloodline. It took another step, the chains at its wrists dragging behind, and when it spoke, the voice was not a growl but a whisper, cracked and dry, carrying generations inside it. It said her name. Not Claire, the other one. The old one. The one written on the first page of the Bible. The voice was trembling, almost tender, as if it were calling its child home. And then she remembered the final line scrawled in the back of that book, the one she'd tried not to think about since she read it. Asterisk, he still walks, and we are never done. Asterisk.